Imagine you were graded like livestock in a brick town where the mill whistle set your pulse, and you finally had a chance at revenge. On the night a blue norther flattened the river reeds, the chapel bell masked footsteps at the records office. She opened the cabinet with a borrowed brass key, lifted the improvement ledger, and slid a twin she had forged beneath the blotter. She salted the town's story with paper, school slips rewritten, baptism rolls recast, numbers that would not reconcile. But when escape began, the chapel warden changed the bell cadence without warning, and every lookout along the mill yard glanced at the tower at once, exactly when the office lamp guttered to smoke. Would the misdirection hold, or would the ledger that owned families own her name as well? Before we dive in, subscribe if you value original investigations, new cases every week. The case surfaced in the modern day as so many factory town secrets do, in an archive basement where climate control hums like a tame storm. On October 6, 2023, at the University Archives in Urbana, a graduate assistant cataloging parish books from St. Bridget Chapel laid a baptism roll beside a stack of school transfer slips from schoolhouse number 2. A graphite shadow crossed both, the same faint number beside separate surnames. The charged image that traveled through the department later that afternoon was not sensational. A close shot of facing pages, one damp-stained, one crisp, tethered by the same ghostly 7 penciled in a clerk's hand where no mark belonged. The discovery vector became an academic paper draft by Winter, a crosswalk of sacramental registers and municipal records that should never have agreed, and yet did. Down columns where, in theory, God and school kept separate books. The town in question lay along the Kankakee, a factory appendage built around a brickworks and a textile shed whose roof trapped humid heat from May to September and exhaled chalk frost from November to March. Everyone's time lay in mechanical things, the pre-dawn bell that stirred the boarding houses, the noon glare in the yard when the kiln doors breathed, the blue hour when the chapel lamp beckoned. Surveillance required no walls. It was in rosters and bells, in keys that hung on specific hooks, in the way foremen watched who crossed from mill yard to records office and who walked down North Road toward River Landing. The system relied on paper and pulse, wages calculated to keep families indebted to the company store, and a new reformist gloss that promised improvement by arrangement. It called itself Science and Morality, and wrote itself into a single thick volume stamped on the front board with one word: ledger. Lydia Hartwell arrived to this world with a teacher's certificate, an ink-stained blouse, and the compulsion to count what others preferred to feel. She kept the schoolhouse clock wound, ran attendance by rows, and hid a private ritual in plain sight, a small cross made of twine she touched before she sharpened the first slate pencil each morning. Her competence lay in paper arithmetic and the stubborn patience of long division. Her vulnerability lay in a tremor that visited her left hand when she was hungry or frightened. It showed itself only when she was alone at the desk after the children had gone, balancing columns, and the tremor ran the length of her forearm as if the numbers themselves shivered. The wound that hardened into motive came the winter after she took the post. The factory owner's agents visited the school to implement a new pairing scheme meant to improve worker vigor. The idea was simple and cruel. Scores were assigned in a private improvement ledger, and families were shuffled through transfer slips and sacramental schedules to encourage unions the ledger favored and to discourage those it did not. Lydia learned it the way one learns the shape of a trap by the marks it leaves. A boy with a Slavic surname moved from row 3 to row 1 overnight. A girl from the Marsh cottages vanished from the register after a hasty baptism. 2 cousins, formerly neighbors, suddenly listed as boarded. She traced the entries by index finger and felt the tremor. Paper had become a yoke. The antagonists wore official roles that insulated them from the moral weight of their acts. Each had a method of control and a predictable weakness. First, there was Mr. Ephraim Calhoun, owner of the brickworks and de facto mayor. His vice was arid pride cloaked in benevolence. He spoke of uplift and thrift and paid wages just shy of what a family needed to stay solvent. His method of control was architectural. The boarding houses, the company store, and the schoolhouse itself all bore his stamp, each an entry point to debt or favor. His weakness was a ledger fetish. He believed a town could be governed by columns if one only counted ruthlessly enough. Second, Deacon Silas Boone at St. Bridget Chapel. He held the baptism rolls in a ring of cabinet keys and liked to call himself a guardian of souls. His vice was a taste for order over mercy. He cooperated with the ledger by aligning sacraments to the pairing scheme. Baptisms timed to keep families inside certain lines. His weakness was ritual rigidity. He rang the chapel bell at exactly the same times across seasons, teaching the town to breathe to his cadence. Third, Clerk Winfield Dodd at the records office off the mill yard. He delighted in carbon copies, neat spines of transfer slips, and deep drawers that hummed when pushed shut. His vice was petty dominion. He could ruin a household with a notation. His method of control was the quiet veto: misfile a slip, delay a signature, backdate a change. His weakness was vanity. He smoked a particular imported cigarette that left star-shaped ash that no one else in Kankakee County could afford. Lastly, Constable Nathan Pike, a long frame in a gray wool coat who patrolled North Road to River Landing. His vice was convenience. He enforced what kept the mill quiet and let the rest slide. His method of control was presence at crossings, making sure people went where paper said they should. His weakness was weather. He hated the river wind and avoided the banks when the blue norther came through. The signature artifact in this story was the ledger itself, a calf-bound book with brass corners and a spine that cracked like a knuckle when opened. Lydia first touched it by accident when she delivered a spelling list to the records office, and Clerk Dodd, flattered by her accuracy, angled the book toward her. She did not read, only counted. The number of lines per page told her the scale. Later, she would learn the key's bite and the way the paper took ink from a steel nib without feathering. The method she would choose, when endurance turned to action, was misdirection. Silent tools applied to paper and time. Not fire and not poison, but numbers that would disagree in the exact places where power trusted them to align. Evidence objects seeded themselves through the winter in ways no one thought would matter. A decoy keyring fashioned from classroom cabinet brass, a rusted lock from an abandoned shed near the storehouse, a set of school transfer slips with an odd watermark that only appeared when held to the window, a baptism roll with candle soot along the lower margin, a smear of carbon paper on the inside of a ledger drawer that the clerk would later claim he had never used. Lydia took note, wrote none of it down, and tucked her observations behind the twine cross in her pocket. The unexpected witness would be a child, a choir boy, whose job it was to tug on the bell rope at dusk. He watched the yard because the rope window faced the mill yard, and he noticed who walked when the bell masked their steps. The system's surveillance appeared benign. Attendance charts hung in the schoolroom. The company store tallied purchases in red pencil. The chapel posted sacrament times on a board by the door. But add them together, and one could track desire and debt. The pairing scheme sat at the center. Couples rated high were rewarded with better boarding rooms and store credit. Those rated low found their children transferred to shifts in the storehouse or their baptisms delayed until they signed the right papers. When Lydia's cousin, newly widowed and light with a fever, was pressed into a union by the ledger and then vanished from the school's column 3 weeks later, the numbers ceased to be abstractions. The wound took a face. It hardened. From competence in site physics, a plan grew. Lydia knew the lock geometry of the records office because she watched Clerk Dodd's glove catch, and from the way he shook the hand, she inferred a burr on the bolt. She knew the wind shear along North Road that lifted smoke and carried small sounds toward the river. She knew the chapel's bell schedule, as well as her own breath. During blue hour on selected days, the bell covered movements in the yard for exactly 7 strokes. The method, then, would be to split the ledger's truth. She would create a twin, an echo on paper that looked right from a distance and failed up close. The twin would move where the original sat, the original would become a ghost, and the parish rolls would refuse the mill's arithmetic. Tools collected in a drawer, no one checked. A steel nib filed blunt to mimic the clerk's hand, a blotter cut from classroom felt, a strip of carbon paper salvaged from the trash behind the office, and the decoy keyring. She borrowed a brass tag from a school cabinet, filed it into a tooth pattern to test the records office lock on the abandoned shed's rusted hasp, and learned the push that seated the burr. She practiced seating drawers without the chime that betrayed a quick hand. She timed herself by the bell. The antagonists remained themselves, and thus predictable. Mr. Calhoun walked the mill yard before noon on market days, inspecting shipments and looking pleased at columns of kilned brick in the ledger house. Deacon Boone polished his keys and rehearsed the familiar pieties about better families for a better town. Clerk Dodd smoked at regular intervals, flicking star-shaped ash into a tray he had buffed to a mirror. Constable Pike cut his rounds on cold nights and stood with his back to the river whenever the wind rose. Lydia also watched the river landing, where once a week a ferry came downstream with school supplies and left with a mailbag thick with forms. When the blue norther came, she knew, the landing would be empty. Her private ritual changed as winter deepened. The twine cross in her pocket became not only a comfort, but a ruler. She measured margins by its arms. She counted stair treads by the cross's length when she could not carry a lamp. She ran the twine across the ledger page once, lightly, and saw that the grain ran right. The twin would need the same paper stock. She located it in a shipment of blank minute books ordered for the school board. She requisitioned one and tucked it beneath the schoolhouse floorboards with the rusted lock, the decoy keys, and the carbon strip wrapped in cloth. By early March of 1887, the town's routines sharpened to a point. Pairings increased, transfers accelerated, the ledger thickened. Lydia's cousin's absence widened like a hole in the roster. A rumor, half song and half prayer, began to move in the boarding houses, that the numbers could be sung back to sense. It carried no words, and yet the children hummed it. The charged image from the modern archive, those twin pages, baptism and school, both marked by a phantom 7, lay coiled in the past like a spring. The night that would release it presented itself with weather. A blue norther came down out of unseen fields, flattening the reed heads by the river and slamming shutters. The wind erased footfalls on North Road and pushed smoke out of stovepipes along the mill yard so sharply that Clerk Dodd closed the records office window early. Deacon Boone, a man of habit, tugged the bell rope at dusk as always, but the gust stole the first stroke and he compensated with an extra. The town looked up, a beat off, and then returned to its tasks. Inside the schoolhouse, Lydia arranged the decoy keyring on a length of twine, tested the felt blotter under her palm, and rehearsed the drawer's quiet seat in her mind. She counted quietly to 7, breathed, and traced the route in her head. Schoolhouse number 2 to mill yard, shadow the kiln wall, pivot at the records office door, insert the key, turn with steady pressure past the burr, lift the ledger, plant the twin, blot close, seat the drawer without the chime. On the return, pivot to St. Bridget Chapel, slide 2 names along the baptism roll to misalign the ledger's arithmetic, and leave the soot-smudged margin exactly as she found it. Some stories begin with a bang. This one began with a bell. The blue hour thickened, bringing the first flurries of sleet that hissed where they struck the river. The choir boy climbed the chapel stair, his fingers already chafed from rope burn earned across many evenings of 7 strokes. In the mill yard, the kiln doors breathed and went quiet. At the records office, the lamp flame combed the inside of the shade and leaned as the gusts rose. Lydia stepped into the wind, the twine cross warm in her palm. The chapel bell rope went taut. The first stroke struck late, the second followed quick. Somewhere between the 5th and the 6th, the cadence would slip. She waited for the count she had measured by weeks of watching and rode her step against the sound. The town listened without listening, as it always had. And then the bell began. The weather did half the work. The blue norther pressed the town flat, pulled at coats and bit at knuckles, until even habitual watchers drew inside door frames. Lydia Hartwell timed herself to the bell and to whine she had studied from schoolhouse number 2 windows across many evenings. She held the twine cross in one palm and the decoy keyring in the other, the brass tag filed to a tooth that could bully the burr inside the records office lock. The plan came from what the site allowed: stone to break sight lines, wind shear to cover skids, bell strokes to mask tiny metal complaints, lamp flame to tell her when the clerk stepped away to relight. She moved along the lee of the kiln stack inside the mill yard, a smear against brick. The first set piece began. Objective: split the town's truth. Remove the original improvement ledger and plant a twin that would pass at a glance, yet fail at the margins. Execution: At the records office door, she pressed the decoy key forward with steady pressure, feeling for the burr she had mapped by patience. The lock accepted, then balked, then yielded. Inside, lamp flame combed sideways in the gust, thinned, and went to smoke that varnished the shade with a brown oval. The room's geometry held sound. She crossed to the cabinet where Clerk Winfield Dodd stabled his pride, the calf-bound ledger with brass corners. She traced the spine with 2 fingers to verify the crackled knuckle of the binding, slid it free in one slow lift and set it on felt to mute the board's complaint. From beneath her cloak came the twin, minute bookstock, edges singed with a candle to counterfeit age, headings copied with a blunted steel nib to mimic the clerk's hesitant loop. She slid the twin beneath the blotter, worked 2 sample figures in the clerk's hand with the carbon strip underlaid to fake bite through to the next sheet, and closed the book so that a ghost of ink would kiss the opposite page. The desk drawer wanted to chime on closure. She fed the felt along its runners and seated it without a note. Breadcrumbs placed themselves without flair. A faint smear of carbon brushed the inside edge of the ledger drawer where she had stabilized the strip, an ink bruise that later would not agree with Clerk Dodd's claim never to use carbon. Star-shaped ash from his favored imported cigarette marked the tray in an untouched constellation. She left it exactly as it lay so that any change of position would testify to movement unrelated to her hands. The lamp, guttered to smoke, printed a crescent of soot on the ledger board, none of it dramatic, all of it cumulative. The bell carried her out again. She pulled the office door to just short of latch so wind could not thump it and draw eyes. At her side, the calf-bound original pressed heat into her rib where she had cinched it beneath the cloak. The choice to carry the original rather than pages alone made the night irreversible. A torn folio could be deniable, a whole book told a different story. She made the second line of the plan with care. The ledger would not travel far by foot in this weather. It would sleep beneath the schoolhouse floor for one night behind the rusted lock she had reclaimed from the abandoned shed, and the ferry would take facsimiles and slips, not the book itself, upriver in the morning to force outside arithmetic upon the town. Objective: misaligned sacramental names that Clerk Dodd had counted upon, seed an irreconcilable disagreement between parish and office. Execution: St. Brigid's side door coughed in the gust. Deacon Silas Boone kept ritual like a metronome. Even sleet could not alter the angle of his hands on the cabinet ring. Lydia knew his rigidity and used it. She ascended the narrow stair toward the choir loft where the rope cleated. The window there faced the mill yard. The choir boy, the unexpected witness, warmed his hands by his own breath and watched the yard because the rope window made a frame of it. He saw a figure in a dark cloak slide along the kiln wall and, in a child's way, counted between bell strokes without knowing what he measured. Lydia used the bell's mask to reach the sacristy table. She opened the baptism roll to the week where 2 surnames had been prepared to move like pawns. With the steel nib she had blunted to mimic the parish hand. She lifted a middle initial into a first name and drifted one godparent notation to the wrong margin. The candle's soot, inevitable in winter, already smudged the lower edge of the page. She kept it so and used it to hide a weight of pressure that only a careful reader would detect later. The roll now said a different story in places that counted. She replaced the key where Boone always left it, on the 3rd hook, knowing that his weakness, ritual, would make him miss what changed so long as the frame of the act remained neat. The choir boy tugged the rope for the final stroke. The sound masked her descent on the north stair. Objective: fabricate transfer slips that looked legal to anyone in the records office, yet contained a watermark that betrayed them to an outside eye. Introduce those slips into a chain of custody beyond Mr. Ephraim Calhoun's reach. Execution: inside schoolhouse number 2. She pried up the loose board she had cut weeks earlier and slid the original ledger into the dark space, cinching it with the rusted lock and a twist of twine. She brought out the school board minute book stock that matched the ledger's grain and cut it into transfer slips. The watermark she needed was a flaw, a faint wave in the paper near one corner that only revealed itself when held to a window. She wrote 3 slips that relocated children whose families the pairing scheme had targeted, dating each in Clerk Dodd's habit, weekday first, then month, then day, with the same peculiar flourish on the final digit. She laid the carbon strip beneath only the first of each triplicate, so that the pressure impression on the bottom copy would be too faint, something a county clerk would notice when asked to file. Community logistics moved in parallel. 2 elders from the boarding houses, as prearranged, staggered their coal scuttles along North Road so that their silhouettes from the chapel window made a ranked screen for anyone crossing the open. Their payment would be paid later in flour from the teacher's allotment. A seamstress in the storehouse who owed Lydia nothing and owed the ledger less leaned her broom against the door at a certain angle that meant the constable's last pass had already taken him toward the square. Children, 3 of them, warm with purpose, were tasked with nothing more dangerous than timing. One hummed the rumor tune in the schoolyard if a patrol doubled back. One stood at the corner where Millyard became North Road to pick up a slate and wipe it, slow, if the chapel bell began an unscheduled peal. The choir boy, without knowing why, watched the rope window. Objective: force external math, make the pairing scheme stumble where it could not threaten. Execution: the river landing sat low and dark, slick with sleet. Constable Nathan Pike disliked the cold bite and had abandoned the bank for a sheltered stoop near the square, which made his weakness useful. The postmaster kept the ferry bag in a locked box with a town key. The box itself was built for convenience, not security. Lydia used the decoy keyring and the same patient pressure to persuade the hasp. Inside, she nested the 3 transfer slips with a note to the county superintendent written in a teacher's neutral hand, requesting confirmation of receipt for boarded minors whose records appeared to be duplicated. She included 1 sheet rubbed with the carbon strip underlay to match Clerk Dodd's bite, and 1 rubbed without so that the county office would see inconsistency. She did not sign. The watermark would speak for her. The countermove came unasked and in pattern with the teaser that would one day introduce this case to strangers. Deacon Boone, battling a gust in the bell tower, miscounted. The first stroke had been laid earlier. Now he overcompensated. A stutter came between strokes that residents had heard in only one circumstance: funerals. Heads lifted. In the mill yard, a foreman paused and looked to the bell. In the records office, Clerk Dodd, who had stepped out to bully the lamp back to flame and to enjoy 2 fast draws from his imported cigarette, turned toward the cabinet. The change in cadence broke Lydia's mask of noise. She adapted 1 beat faster than her hunger tremor could betray. She left the mailbag box unlatched on purpose so no extra click would broadcast her presence, and moved into the lee of the landing's boathouse where sleet hissed on river skin. She counted the missed strokes backward and built new cover. Not the bell now, but the wind, which drove loose boards to tap a steady wooden code. Clerk Dodd's lamp, once relit, cast light into the records office that reached the ledger board and found the crescent of soot her first entry had printed. He lifted the blotter. He would later say in testimony that he smelled something wrong in the room. He slid open the drawer, and for the first time in months, it did not chime. His star-shaped ashes remained undisturbed. Everything seemed in place, which meant trouble of a kind he could not measure. He tried the cabinet. He touched the ledger's brass corner and felt his own handwriting looking back at him, and did not know why the book felt slightly cooler than it should. The choir boy watched the yard through the rope window, small hands red from effort. He saw Dodd's silhouette stiffen. He saw a cloaked figure at the landing move, only when boards knocked in the wind. He saw 2 elders bend to their scuttles on North Road as if the cold had defeated them. He would not be asked for what he saw until much later, and then only in the roundabout way that towns question children when something has slipped. Lydia closed the mailbag box and eased the hasp down without the tiny ring the latch gave when allowed to fall. She returned along North Road, counting slate wipes and humming to herself the rumor tune the children had made into a kind of shield. At the schoolhouse, she lowered herself into the crawl space and cinched the rusted lock through the hasp that kept the floorboard fast. She smoothed the board and sat with her back to the wall until her hands steadied. Then she prepared for the last motion, the one that would turn the night from sabotage to exposure. She needed one more breadcrumb placed where an outside eye would trip. In the storehouse ledger nook, there lay a small stack of supply requisitions. She added a request for minute book paper, school board stock, dated in Clerk Dodd's habit, and initialed with his small hook. It would explain the origin of the paper she had used and fix him to a timeline. She set the requisition 3rd in the stack, not top, where a hurried search would miss it, and a careful one would find it. The town adjusted to the bell as if nothing had happened. Men went back to their boards. Women held doors against the gusts. Deacon Boone tugged the final stroke with his lips pressed thin against the error, his ritual stinging him more than the wind. The choir boy let the rope tail through his palms and watched the yard one beat longer than usual. In the morning, the ferry would nose the landing, take the mailbag, and start up along the brown curve of the river, the bag heavy by 3 sheets and light by 1 certainty. By the time Mr. Ephraim Calhoun took his noon walk through the meal yard to feel the satisfying weight of ledgers turning under his fingers, a superintendent's clerk upriver would already have 1 triplicate in hand and a question in the margin. In the records office, Clerk Dodd would keep touching the twin, not understanding why the paper under his pen took ink with a slightly different thirst than yesterday. In St. Bridget, Deacon Boone would polish his keys with more force than required and not notice the candle soot darkening the exact line where 2 names had moved. Lydia stood at the river guardrail until sleet stung the ungloved parts of her fingers, then turned back across North Road toward schoolhouse number 2. The twine cross lay flat against her palm, damp from the cloak's hem. She had committed the town to an outside reader. The original ledger lay sealed beneath the floor, unseen yet very present, like a heart under a rib. Point of no return arrived not with pursuit, but with schedule. The ferry horn sounded once, low, and the deckhand flipped the mailbag over his shoulder. The rope slipped from the mooring post and slapped water in a lazy arc. Lydia watched the bag vanish into the dark-throated cabin and knew that when it came back downriver, it would carry not answers but inquiries written in a different hand, on a different paper, with a different jurisdiction behind it. Whatever the mill and parish called order would have to stand up to arithmetic outside the town's reach. Wind pulled the last sleet into needles, and then, as weather sometimes does when the decisive act is past, it softened. Across the square, the chapel bell rope hung still. Somewhere inside the records office, a drawer that should chime lay closed and silent. The ledger's twin rested where the original had, perfectly confident. In the crawl space, the real book waited with the rusted lock set and the carpenter's dust undisturbed. The act ended on a test that no one could halt. The mailboat sliding against the current, its wake lifting the reed heads, the bag sealed by a clerk's knot and headed upriver. The clock the town obeyed was no longer only bell and ledger, it had become the county's calendar. The river carried the question first. By the following Tuesday, the county superintendent's office in Joliet opened the ferry bag in a room that smelled of paste, lamp oil, and threadbare wool. A clerk held the 3 transfer slips to a window and saw what the town had been trained not to see: a faint watermark wave on 2 corners and a 2-light carbon impression on the 3rd copy where a firm hand should have bitten through. He logged the anomaly in a minute book and stamped the envelope for return with a red seal. That same morning, he wrote a plain request for reconciliation. Kindly provide original roll entries and school attendance for the children named. The letter named dates and asked for ledger page numbers. It also copied the state inspector in Springfield. The bag closed again and turned downriver with the county's calendar inside it. The discovery inside Kankakee County began not with trumpets, but with Clerk Winfield Dodd's unease hardening into procedure. He had spent 2 days with the twin, tracing columns that felt convincingly his and yet not quite. On Wednesday, he noticed a soot crescent on the ledger board, exactly where the lamp had guttered that blue hour night. He had not left it. On Thursday, he slid the drawer and heard only wood because felt lined the runners. The absence of the chime nagged. He took out the blotter and found a faint carbon bruise along the inner edge that did not belong to him. He logged a private note in his desk book in a tight hand, then did what his vanity preferred not to do. He reported a possible interference to Mr. Ephraim Calhoun. Calhoun answered by demanding a demonstration of order. He walked the mill yard before noon, with one gloved hand on the ledgers stacked in the records office, and the other tucked behind his back as if taking the town's pulse. He summoned Deacon Silas Boone to St. Bridget Chapel and asked for baptism roll extracts so that parish and office could once again agree. He sent Constable Nathan Pike to the river landing to greet the ferry personally and receive any county correspondence the instant it arrived. The ferry came at mid-afternoon on a Friday with a low horn that folded into river fog. Constable Pike brought the sealed envelope to the records office and waited in the door as Dodd slit wax with a paper knife and read. The letter's phrasing was not accusatory. It was arithmetic. Dodd felt his ribs tighten against his vest when the superintendent asked for original roll entries and gave dates that exactly straddled the week of the Blue Norther. He looked up and asked Pike to fetch Deacon Boone. Word traveled in the way factory towns move it, through gestures, through who walked fast and who did not, through the direction of shoulders in a yard. By Vespers, the boarding houses knew that the county had asked for a count the town could not control. The discovery phase looked like ordinary work executed with unusual care. In the records office, Dodd set the twin on the desk and opened to the pages the county had flagged. He compared entries to transfer slips. His finger paused on a numeral that looked like his and yet leaned too slightly toward the margin. The lamp flame combed the shade. Soot printed a second crescent, today's, counterpart to the one Lydia had left the night of the swap. In St. Brigid, Boone unrolled the baptism register on the sacristy table and found a middle initial that did not sit where his ritual hands would have placed it, and a godparent notation too close to a soot-smudged line. He did not say so. He logged a private note about irregular spacing on a scrap he burned, then sent Dodd a copy of the requested extracts. At schoolhouse number 2, Lydia balanced attendance against the questions in the county letter and prepared the file bundle that would travel upriver by the morning ferry. The institutional response assembled like a scaffold. On Monday, April 4th, 1887, the county school superintendent's deputy, a broad man named Mr. Lang, arrived by coach with an embossed folder and a narrow briefcase that clicked shut like a well-cut lock. He convened a reconciliation session in the town hall boardroom, a spare space with map pins stuck in a Lynn County map and a portrait of a governor going sepia. Participants sat according to rank, Calhoun at the head of the table, Dodd with his ledger and tray of Star Ash cigarettes, Deacon Boone with the baptism roll wrapped in linen, Lydia with the attendance book and a minute book for spare paper, Constable Pike along the wall with arms folded to look official. The process was mechanical. Lang read names and dates. Dodd answered with page and line. Boone recited sacrament times and godparent names with a precision that bordered on defiance. Lydia supplied attendance, absent marks, and transfer dates. The tension came not from voices, none rose, but from the friction of paper that refused to align. At the second family on the list, the superintendent's deputy asked to examine the ledger itself rather than a recitation from it. The calf-bound volume crossed the table. Lang turned pages and remarked mildly on the faint carbon echo visible along one inner edge. Unusual for a book Dodd claimed never to treat with carbon. He held the paper at an angle and watched the grain take light. He asked where the volume had been bound. Dodd answered with pride. In town at the company's contractor. Lang nodded and said nothing. When the session ended for the day, Lang asked for site visits. He went first to schoolhouse number 2. Lydia unlocked her desk, offered attendance books, and remarked that triplicate transfer slips sometimes developed faint bottom copies if a blunt nib were used. Lang nodded again and asked, without emphasis, to see the crawl space beneath the floor. Lydia lifted the loose board and showed the dark. She did not show the rusted lock. Lang examined the joists, ran a finger along the dust, and let the board settle. He visited St. Brigid next and stood at the rope window where the choir boy had watched the yard. He pulled the rope once and counted, old habit from a life spent with schedules, and looked over the yard the way a bell does when it makes itself the town's spine. On Tuesday, April 5th, Lang visited the records office with a local justice of the peace. He asked Dodd to close the drawer, then open it, then close it again. He listened to wood. He asked Dodd to relight the lamp. The flame leaned in a draft and printed a new crescent on the ledger board beside the old. Lang opened the ledger and scraped a nail gently across a page margin to watch the fiber rise. He said nothing about the burr in the lock. His hand knew enough locks to feel a recent persuasion. He did, however, ask to see supply requisitions. Dodd produced the storehouse stack. Lang leafed until he found a request for minute book paper, school board stock, signed in Dodd's hand and dated a week before the Blue Norther. He set the requisition aside without comment. By Wednesday, Lang wrote a memorandum in the town hall boardroom that formed the spine of what the press later called the Kankakee Inquiry. It did not say fraud. It said incompatibilities between ecclesial registers and municipal ledgers related to a private pairing program. It recommended a hold on new pairings, a county custody review for transferred children, and a state circular reminding towns that arrangements could not alter school or sacrament without voluntary assent. He sent a copy upriver to Springfield and a copy downriver to the local weekly. In the room, Mr. Calhoun kept his face in a position that meant the portrait on the wall was watching him. Consequences fell in measured weight. The county suspended the pairing scheme pending review. Dodd was relieved of duties until the conclusion of reconciliation and told to turn over keys, including the cabinet key, whose tooth felt strangely smooth under Lang's fingers. Deacon Boone was rotated to a rural chapel 3 townships west, a face-saving measure called a temporary reassignment that read like a reprimand to anyone literate in ecclesial euphemism. Constable Pike received a note in his personnel file about neglect of riverine patrol under adverse weather, which in plain speech meant he had been inside when the bag mattered. Mr. Calhoun was not charged with a crime. He received a letter from the state inspector advising against private eugenic experiments masked as benevolence, and the company store quietly altered its credit policy by summer to blunt what the inquiry had named as a lever. The original ledger did not return by parade. Lydia brought it up at dusk 1 week after Lang left, when the schoolhouse light could be called routine. She unlocked the rusted lock, brushed carpenter's dust from the calfskin, and carried the book in both hands to the town hall boardroom. The justice of the peace received it and wrote a receipt in his neat, cautious script. He sealed the volume with wax and placed it in a county crate bound for Springfield. The twin remained on records office shelves, its utility gone. In time, it gathered dust in the same pattern as the real book had gathered soot, the kind of patina that makes false things look old enough to blend. What of Lydia? She did not become public hero. Factory towns do not often let that happen. She accepted an offer from the county superintendent to take a post 2 districts upriver in a schoolhouse with tall windows that faced corn rather than a kiln wall. She left without ceremony, taking her twine cross and leaving her decoy keyring wrapped in cloth at the back of a drawer in schoolhouse number 2, not as a trophy, but as a lesson. The children saw her off from River Landing, 3 of them humming the rumor tune that had covered so much of the plan without knowing what it was. The choir boy did not wave. He watched the rope window because someone had to ring the bell. The inquiry did not hang a villain in the square. It changed routines, which is a kind of judgment that lasts longer. The records office bought a new lock whose burr resisted persuasion. Drawers were lined not with felt, but with metal guides that chimed in a different register when hurried. The chapel posted an explanation of bell cadences to end confusion at funerals. The company store shifted to printed credit books that required signatures in duplicate, 1 copy to the county. Transfer slips carried visible watermarks and a county seal embossed so deep that even a blunt nib could not fake the impression. Boarding house talk changed shape. People still counted the bell, but now they counted the ferry too. Press response came as column inches. The Kankakee Ledger, a weekly that had previously praised improvement as a Christian idea, ran a careful piece on April 15th under the headline, "County Seeks Alignment of Records." A Chicago paper lifted the phrase and sharpened it into paper children, a term that stuck less because of its accuracy than because it fit. Within 2 months, the state superintendent issued Circular Number 12, reminding towns that no matrimonial scheme, however clothed in science, may use school or parish to bind bodies. The phrase found its way into homilies, stump speeches, and angry letters to editors. It became an echo the way policy sometimes becomes song. Forensic residues continued to tell the story long after the protagonists stepped aside. The soot crescents on the ledger board, laid down on 2 different days under 2 different lamps, remained visible even after the office changed oil and wick. The requisition slip for minute book paper kept its place in the storehouse stack and then moved to a county file where it slept beside Lang's memorandum and the justice's receipt. The rusted lock bore a bright new scratch where Lydia's twine had rubbed it, and when the schoolhouse was repaired 2 summers later, that lock went up on a nail in the janitor's room, a relic with no label. The star-shaped ash in Dodd's tray became a story clerks told about vanity and its footprints. The discovery, judgment, and consequences did not make the town just. They made it wary in new directions. Kitchens became places of soft surveillance, ledgers were guarded like safes, pantries were locked not only against hunger, but against arithmetic. Mothers carried baptism certificates in aprons and kept copies against misplacement. Children learned to read dates and weigh the worth of initials. A superstition sprouted that if you touched the chapel rope and counted 7 strokes, the town would reveal one lie it had been telling itself. It was a child's game, but adults played it with their eyes turned toward the mill yard without admitting they were listening. Lydia's name appeared only twice on paper that strangers could find later. Once on the county payroll ledger for a beginning teacher upriver, and once in the minutes of a school board meeting where she requested extra lamp oil to extend winter hours for older pupils. Her cousin's name returned to the attendance book that June with a note, rejoined, and an absence tally that never quite evened out. The pairing scheme never resumed under that name. It resurfaced as a rumor in other towns, always with different clothes, always speaking the same language of benevolence and numbers. The final image returns to the bell that had sung this case into motion. On a late summer evening, with the corn high and the river low, the choir boy, older by 1 year, longer by a head, stood again at the rope window in St. Bridget Chapel. He tugged 7 strokes at dusk. The sound crossed the mill yard, touched the records office, traced North Road, and slid over River Landing where a ferry nosed against a post. Across the square, a woman in a schoolhouse touched a small cross of twine and added a date to a roll in a steady hand. In boarding houses, a quiet tune without words threaded through supper noise and hardened into memory. They called it a rumor, then a song, then a caution. It carried no hero and no villain, only the lesson that paper can be a weapon and a refuge, and that bells can cover harm or masked steps toward repair, depending on who counts and who listens.